Great, thanks a lot, Stephanie. As Stephanie mentioned, this is the final panel of the workshop. Its title is The Bottom Line, Investing in the Future. And I thought I would give a short introduction myself and then hand it to the panelists so that they could also introduce themselves for the panel. So my name is Ted Schur. I'm a professor at Northern Arizona University in the Center for Ecosystem Science and Society. And by training, I'm an ecologist, and I work at the interface between ecosystems and the Earth systems. And I have a particular focus on the interplay between Arctic ecosystems and climate. And so as I've done this work, and you can see in my backdrop here, a nice picture of Denali National Park in Alaska, where I do my research. And I've been going to Alaska for many years, observing the impacts of climate change. And really this work keeps bringing me back to one fundamental fact. And that is really that the more that people act to slow human greenhouse gas emissions, the more time that society has to adapt to oncoming climate change and all of its impacts. And because of this, I'm really invested in the work that all of you are doing to try to enact change at your institutions. And I'm really pleased to be moderating this final panel. Many of the panels have been focused on the nuts and bolts of your day jobs. I think the conversation here is trying to think a little bit more broadly about what carbon neutrality means to us within our institutions and to society as a whole. So we're going to kind of get a little bit more broad to think about this. And so I'd like to turn to our panelists. I know that many of you have served on other panels, but we kind of start fresh each time. And so if you could give a short introduction about yourself, I'll pass it around. And I think, knowing what your day job and title is at your institution, I think for the purpose of this conversation, you might want to say a little bit about what your institution is like in the kind of landscape of universities that are out there, and perhaps kind of where you sit, within your state, within our country. And I think that will help give some context to the discussion. So maybe I'll just call on you by name and we'll just go around for this short intro. So Mike, can I pass it to you first to give us the intro? Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Schur. Honored to be here. I'm hailing from the cooler climes of Central Ohio at Ohio State University. I am the Associate Director with our Sustainability Institute, which is a relatively young entity here at the university that was formed out of two separate prior existing and long-standing entities on campus, one that was focused more on our operations around sustainability and one that was more focused around our academic engagement and curriculum building around sustainability. So it just made sense for us to merge those two entities together and try to bring our academic mission together with our operational execution around our university sustainability goals. The university itself is one of the, I think, 3 largest universities in the nation. We're a small campus of 110,000 people or so a day. So we are a small city within the larger city of Columbus. We also have regional campuses throughout Ohio, and as the state's land grant, we have basically offices in every county in Ohio executing extension and outreach efforts. Personally, my background is a little bit of a winding road to the university. My background is actually environmental public policy. I started with the state legislature, worked for the Nature Conservancy in a government relations capacity for about a decade before joining then Ohio Governor Ted Strickland's administration as his environmental policy aide with a dual appointment in our Department of Natural Resources as External Affairs Director. And then we lost re-election, unfortunately, so I had to find another gig and hooked up with Scott Miracle-Gro to run their sustainability and corporate responsibility program for about 6 years before coming to the university to help out our efforts here.
Great, thanks, Mike, for that. I didn't reveal from my background that I grew up in Michigan, and so I'm your neighbor across the way, at least from way back. And I promise not to save my toughest questions for you, but I'm sure we'll have a good conversation nonetheless. Ian, you show up in my screen next, so maybe I'll pass the baton to you for an intro.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. I'm Ian Johnson. I'm Director of Sustainability here at Colorado College. I use he, him, his pronouns. Colorado College is slightly smaller than perhaps Ohio. We are a little over 2,000 students, smallish liberal arts, private liberal arts college in Colorado Springs on the Front Range. You may better know us as the college that has pioneered and led the block plan program, where our students take one class at a time, full time for about a month, and then rotate from one class to the next. I too hail originally from the upper Midwest. I grew up in Wisconsin. This is my 8th year at Colorado College. We had set a goal back in 2009 at the what I'll call the demand of our students to achieve carbon neutrality by 2020 and achieve that milestone on January 1st of this year, and have been continue to work from that springboard towards what our next steps are, and continuing to impact our own emissions on campus, as well as global emissions through development of things like carbon markets, and leveraging our educational mission to involve our students in all of the pursuits that relate to sustainability on our campus.
Great, thanks Ian for that introduction. And Stephen, you and I have known each other for a while, and we've engaged recently during this calendar year on the topics of carbon neutrality, and so glad to have you as a panelist. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks for having me. Just turn my headphones on. So I, like Ted, I'm an ecosystem ecologist by training. I'm a professor of biology at Brown University, which is intermediate in size between Colorado College and the Ohio State. We're situated in Providence, Rhode Island, and I come from the faculty side, but in 2018, the provost asked me to join his office as the first provost for sustainability, as far as I know, in the country. So it's out. My job really is to merge the academic mission with the facilities mission of reducing emissions. And I would say that, like many of us, our university has come to the realization that teaching about global change and tropical forests and carbon cycling and all the things that we research is simply not enough to get the job done fast enough. That emissions continue to rise, our own emissions continue to rise, and we need to do something differently, or this is the problem for which we will be apologizing for the centuries to come. And so I've learned an awful, I'm not an engineer. I said this on a previous panel. I've had to learn an awful lot about the way that a campus is heated and cooled and powered from the people who know that. And I've had to do a lot of crosstalk between the people who are carrying out the day-to-day of the campus and the people who are trying to vision for what emissions should be. And that's been a really interesting journey, and one that I think is necessary towards getting to a zero carbon future. And the other thing I would say is that we have, like I think all of the institutions involved in this great workshop over the past 3 days, we've really been trying to force ourselves to look ourselves in the face. That is, we talk a lot about carbon neutrality and we talk a lot about the need for a zero emissions future. But the truth is that until recently, many of our institutions, almost all of our institutions, haven't been living up to that aspiration. And so we're really trying to ask ourselves the hard questions, not just about how we can get to net zero, but how we can get to zero, and how we can enable our friends and neighbors and colleagues to do the same, because otherwise these efforts will be largely in vain. So that's a really hard thing to do, but one for which I'm really happy to be a part of, and certainly happy to be a part of this group of great other institutions that are trying to follow that same path.
Yeah, great. Well, nice to meet all of you. And I think actually across the panel, I feel like we span a range of institution size, geography, political geography. And so it's kind of an interesting mix of people here for this conversation. Just a quick reminder, as Stephanie said, for people that are listening in, you're free to put questions into the Q&A box, and those can get raised to individual panelists or to the whole panel. So I encourage that. After this session, we'll have a brief wrap up by Bruce Hungate, Center Director, and then an open networking session, and that link will be in the chat box. So just before we go further, I wanted to draw attention back there. I think Stephen sort of put a nice punctuation sort of on the topic of this particular panel. I think you know, lots of other panels really thought about the nuts and bolts of operationalizing net carbon neutrality and how to make it work and what are the elements of that. And a lot of people's day-to-day job kind of focuses on those elements. And I think for this panel, we can take that in mind, but then also think a bit further out. And so I think I'll start with a very open-ended question to each of you, but just with a statement that's our reality, which is right now, emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere is currently something that each of us do and our institutions do for free. But science shows us there's likely to be downstream costs of doing this, and that these costs could be overwhelmingly high. I mean, that's one sort of backdrop to what motivates us. And then I think the other fact of this is that the costs that we think might come in the future, these costs might be borne by other people. It could be people that haven't emitted many greenhouse gases. These costs could also be borne by people with lower capabilities for adaptation. So there's all sorts of equity and social justice issues as we look out into the future. And I know that many people working in this sphere think long range, but then we are also operating, you know, each year we may have a budget, you know, determined by the state and determined by the university. So we have this day-to-day reality. And so, you know, this is a tough space to be in, right? You meet goals, but you may or may not have a framework that lets you do it exactly how you want. And I'm going to pose this first question that is very open-ended. I'm going to sort of ask each of you and get some of your thoughts. But you know, there's one hand, what's the financial cost of achieving carbon neutrality? So what can we do? How much do we have to pay to operationalize that? And then I think then there's the sort of separate topic of what's the intrinsic value of doing this? We know, like I just said, emitting CO2 is for free. So really we're buying something we're already getting for free, but that's not the true cost. There are these intrinsic costs that we may accrue in the future. So with that as a backdrop, maybe I'll just reverse the order and ask each of the panelists one at a time. Stephen, I'll start with you. Sort of, what's it going to cost us to achieve net carbon neutrality, and what might be the intrinsic benefit of doing that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And before I go to the sort of intrinsic costs, I'd like to speak a little bit about the actual costs. So, you know, our best estimate is that to eliminate fossil fuel combustion to our campus and retrofit things so that we're at net zero, not at true zero, but just at net zero, meaning we're purchasing enough renewable electricity to run our campus and have no on-site combustion, will be on the order of $250 million. And we have a goal of doing that by 2040. So that's actually a pretty small drop in our operating budget, but it's a big expense relative to zero, which is what we were planning on spending before. So when you tell the university that that's what it's going to cost, right, that sounds like a really big number. I had a really interesting conversation with our president where I said, you know, well, if it cost $500 million, she said, well, if it costs $500 million, I don't think we can do it. And I said, well, if it cost $500 million and you knew it would solve the problem of climate change, what would you do? And she said, I would write a check out of the endowment tomorrow. And I said, well, it's not going to solve climate change if we do it, but I can tell you that if we don't do it and institutions like ours don't do it, then we will not solve the problem of climate change. So let's turn it around and say the only way we solve this is if we start paying for this free pollution that we've had for so long. And I think that mindset is really important. Now, within that context, of course, we all live within budgets. And so one of the things we've done at Brown is really try to understand over the course of the 15 or 20 years it's going to take us to fully eliminate fossil fuels, Where are the places we can do it relatively cheaply, relatively quickly? And where are the places that we can couple it with other campus renovations? Many of the things that will have to be replaced to get to zero are going to have to be replaced over the next 20 years anyway. And so it's really an argument for a lot of planning up front so that you don't do anything stupid and lock yourself into a pathway that precludes you from getting to net zero. And then the final thing I'll say is, we're in a particular situation as a wealthy university relative to most. And so we have a responsibility to go first and to try to help lower the cost for other universities that don't have as big an endowment or don't have as big a budget. So for example, one of the biggest problems that you've probably heard about over the last couple of days is how do we electrify the heating system on campus? District heating, how do we get it to low temperature hot water? Well, some of the heat pumps required to do that are super expensive and pretty novel. And we're trying to think of that as an opportunity. We'll go first. We're going to try this out. It's done in Europe. Let us try to be some of the first ones in the US to do it. And so that lowers the barrier for entry for other institutions that maybe are a little less able to experiment. That's how we're thinking about it.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. And I think that's it hit on both of these points, sort of the financial cost of what it actually takes, but then sort of this intrinsic value and sort of, being an early adopter has a little bit higher cost. But if you think about the university systems in our nation, we're a place where research happens, new thinking happens, and hopefully that lowers the barrier for others as they can follow. So Ian, can I pass that question on to you, sort of financial cost of doing it versus kind of these sort of more intrinsic values that we need to sometimes sell to administrators?
Yeah, certainly. That's going to be Stephen basically said it all. It's going to be a tough one to follow, but I would echo everything that he said. And everything that you're also saying in that, in some instances we have a responsibility to be early adopters of these. Not only because Colorado College is considered a relatively wealthy institution as well, and that puts us in a position of privilege that we need to be out there leading the way, but also because that's the expectation of higher education in general. We don't have the same profit motive that companies and corporations often have, and we're expected to go out on a limb and try new things and fail to figure out what does work. But that being said, many of the points that Stephen touched on, that many of these things are coming due for maintenance and or replacement, renewal and replacement on our campuses, and building that into the SOP, and so that we're upgrading them appropriately and accordingly. As we built a new library on our campus, we built that as the largest net zero carbon library that I'm aware of out there, right? And the idea was that it's not going to exacerbate our challenges, but it's going to become part of the solution. And then at the same time, we have put money into additional projects across campus. Some of them are more costly, some of them are higher tech, some of them are low tech and not super exciting from a shiny marketing perspective. Right. I mentioned in our last panel that, LED lighting is somewhat run of the mill, but definitely a low hanging fruit. In most cases, those costs can be covered through existing utility budgets. The payback on many of those lighting upgrades are inside of a year. And so we don't even have to find new money for that. And so all of these projects have an upfront cost, but many of them have very reasonable, workable ROIs as well, which is something that we've capitalized on. And over the years has actually made the cost of this effort pay back more than it has cost up front. And in some cases, that's very easy to quantify. We have a set aside budget of about $250,000 a year that we put towards sustainability projects. And on the other hand, some of it is built into the costs of some of these renewable and replacement programs. And it's harder to tease out, this line item or that line item. But we've seen, in reasonable numbers, we've put in, a few $1 million, and we can easily quantify what we've avoided in costs based on our utility expenditures over the years, and it's over $7.5 million. And so, financially, it makes sense. There is a cost up front, but it actually has a savings, has an ROI on it. And shifting a little bit to the intrinsic values of it, it is also putting our money where our mouth is, right? These are values that our students loudly claimed for decades now and demanded that we address. And this is in many ways simply aligning our operational strategy with that in a way that makes financial sense for the future of the college. And then, just to echo, a little more of what Stephen said about the intrinsic value of the demonstration of this, right? That this effort on our campus is a drop in the bucket, right? We've reduced our emissions by about 75% real emissions on campus, and through offsets and other purchases have eliminated the net emissions, right? The atmosphere doesn't really care that much about that, right? It's still kind of bleeding elsewhere across the globe. And so I think the larger intrinsic value is the demonstration value of this, and finding replicable ways, being again out on that leading edge, finding the technologies and the processes that work, finding the ones that don't, and so that we can take this process and these successes and build on that. So we have that multiplier effect as our students come through our educational system and go out into grad school at other schools or into the workplace, and they're taking some of those experiences through working in our office as interns and those successes out there, and building on that and capitalizing on that multiplier effect.
Yeah, great. Thanks for expanding on those thoughts. And there's a couple points we'll come back to later. I like the idea of students being motivated to do this, and we'll think about whether that's something that folds into the university thinking in the future. And then also kind of making these smart decisions in operations. And somehow I think in the university, we're well poised to take people maybe in the faculty that are thinking about sort of the bigger picture and maybe the climate science, but then the people operationalizing it and helping us make smart choices that lock us in the right path for the next 30 years versus a path that we're wanting to be off 10 years later. But Mike, I want to pass it over to you, because you talked about your office maybe being a merge of a couple of those pieces of the university, and maybe get your thoughts about the financial costs of achieving carbon neutrality, or what the steps you've made, and then also these intrinsic values that we've been discussing.
Yeah, thanks. And it is hard to follow with anything new following those great comments already said, but certainly for us, it will be hundreds of millions in capital investment to achieve carbon neutrality. Some of that is going to be, one-time infrastructure investments with obvious maintenance costs off of that. And then sometimes it'll be ongoing costs that we're just going to not have much of an ROI on. So for example, how do we offset things that are outside of our control, like air travel emissions in a large way? So you hope on the net, you're kind of developing enough ROI with the projects that you can control from an infrastructure standpoint, that overall you're delivering a good program and a good value to the university from a financial standpoint. And I'll just give one example in that regard. We've entered into a large public-private partnership to manage our on-campus energy systems, which other institutions are now starting to model as well and implement similar to ours. And a driver of that agreement was carbon neutrality and energy efficiency. And prior to that, the institution was really having difficulty providing the upfront capital necessary to make the changes we know we've needed for a long time. So that agreement is providing, something on the order of $250 million in upfront energy conservation measures. And so we're knocking out, the really low-hanging fruit right now in lighting upgrades and HVAC upgrades. So as the next few years roll on, we'll really transform our campus in that regard to be more efficient. But prior to that agreement, we were doing energy conservation at a building at a time, if that, and now we're knocking out 30 to 50 buildings a year. So the scale at which we have to do things on our campus is kind of daunting sometimes, and that means some significant investments from a financial standpoint. But when we've had the fortune of really strong presidential and provost leadership around climate science and commitment to carbon neutrality. In fact, when we committed to become carbon neutral by 2050 in 2008 under a similar agreement that most institutions are following at this point, we had no idea what our carbon footprint even was. We weren't modeling it. We weren't measuring it. We had no idea what our total sources of emissions were. And so we had absolutely no idea what the cost would be, what the actions would be. But our president at the time was listening to the climate science out of our Berg Climate Center, who's been doing ice core research on melting glaciers for decades. And so, the president was validating a lot of the science that was occurring in the university by making the commitment from an operational standpoint to achieve carbon neutrality, knowing, as has been mentioned otherwise, that what we do is not going to make much of a difference from a global scale, but just from our singular emissions. But what we can do as a demonstration to our wider community across the state, and as a known and trusted entity across the state, we can really develop actions for others to get behind and help them come along too. We've partnered a lot with our communities to help them develop climate action plans and things of that nature. So it's not just what we do within our own footprint. It's how does the university act as a catalyst within the communities we work in to drive them forward as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I think, as we talk about it, if you think about universities, we are in the unique position as institutions in our country to harness these intrinsic values. So often we're thinking about, producing new knowledge or educating students, and we don't know the payoff of those things until the future. Of course, education has always paid off for societies, and we in a way are able to focus on ROI, like many of you have talked about, the immediate return on investment for this fiscal year, but we're also able to kind of leverage some of these more intrinsic qualities of life and things we know to be true in the world to help us get things done. And so, it's a great place to be, I think, in a university, although, you guys mentioned sort of 2007, 2008, and if you think all the way back to Congress, there was a joint bill by Lieberman and McCain, a Democrat and a Republican, to think about, leading the nation forward. Things have obviously changed. We're doing things more at either the state level or the institution level. And I think that's why we're trying to hold this kind of conference and bring back sort of the energy at the local level to make progress and to hear about the experiences that people have. So that's great. And I think a part of, intrinsic value of doing things like this is the dollars and cents we save on energy and the carbon we are reducing. One sort of left turn I'd like to take is thinking about the people that are needed to pull this off. Mike, you mentioned kind of not knowing anything about your carbon footprint as a campus when this initiative was enacted at Ohio State, but then you look around and it turns out you have Richard Alley and all these experts, working on the problem. There's an immense wealth of knowledge. How has your institution invested in the people and the knowledge capital to make this work? And do you think that you've done it as effectively as it can be done at your institution, or are there ways to kind of unite the knowledge that already exists to kind of push this further? And maybe Mike, I'll start with you in that question, sort of the people aspect of this. How's that worked at OSU?
Yeah, it's interesting, in a place as large as us with as many programs academically and operationally as we have a number of units that work on sustainability initiatives, including the carbon neutrality goal. And so for us, from an operations standpoint, there's 5 primary departments, including ours, that work in some capacity in this regard. And then on the academic side, I'm not even sure I can count the number of faculty and student groups that are engaged in the issue. I don't know that we've always been the most effective in getting everyone engaged and getting everyone on board, kind of simultaneously towards towards the goal and towards immediate actions and next steps. There's an old saying here at Ohio State that there's always too much communication and not enough communication. And, so there's a lot of kind of ongoing, education that has to go on to bring folks on board and engaged in bringing their best efforts to the case. So in terms of people investment, we certainly have, invested in staff resources to help manage this effort, not only this one, but our other sustainability goals. But then, we've tried, especially through our office, tried to provide new research grant opportunities and new student engagement opportunities to work on some aspects of this, whether that's through our capstone courses or some of our student groups that are kind of focused and honed in on one specific thing that they can bite off in a semester and get real work done for us and really good insight, but then also gives them something of value to work on and see how the mechanic, kind of lift the veil, lift the curtain behind the numbers, so to speak. And how do these things work at a university? How do these things work within a community? And what are the challenges and obstacles that need to be overcome to drive towards carbon emission reductions and net neutrality? So I think that there's, we're not perfect by any means, but hopefully we're on a continuum to continuously improve in our investments around people engagement.
Yeah, and maybe picking up on that, I mean, one way to think about, internal investment versus outside is kind of how reliant you might be, or your office, on sort of asking a consultant outside the university and paying someone else to get that information versus kind of developing it in-house. And maybe
real quick
Okay.
on that. So our first climate action plan was developed, I think, in 2011, and that was literally an external contract that we kind of bid and had someone write for us with, a lot of our own data, of course. And it reads kind of like a consultant contracted document would read, and it's fine for what it is. But this time around, when we updated it here earlier this year, it took a little longer, but we relied on faculty and a postdoc to really help us develop that document. And it is a much richer document. It has a suite of recommendations across sources of emissions, and it is much more, I think, aligned with university culture and value than what the original climate action plan kind of demonstrates.
Yeah, great. Well, great to hear that experience. And Stephen, I don't know if you want to contrast that or add to that conversation, consultants versus in-house development of resources.
Well, I think that really depends on the scale of the university, right? I mean, the Ohio State is enormous and has an enormous capacity in-house. And the smaller you are, the more holes you have in the knowledge base that you need in order to really approach this. I actually, if it's okay, would like to sort of return to this idea of bridging between the sort of administration and the students and thinking about the intrinsic value, because I think actually that one of the places where we have run afoul with the science as a community is to continually say that our contribution to this problem is educating the future generations to know about it. And as you well know, and the time scale for that is over, right? By the time our undergraduates are our age, the ship will have long sailed, and Arctic permafrost will be churning out methane at a very high rate, right? And so, it's been, I think, a little bit of a dodge on the part of universities to not look at their own emissions and their own activities while saying, well, we're educating the future generation. That's really our contribution. It's not that contribution isn't important. It's vitally important, but it doesn't excuse not taking action at the same time. And I just want to also point out that I think this is where we're critically missing an opportunity, because this issue spans all disciplines. It spans ethics, religion, morality, but also natural sciences, social sciences, economics. We have an opportunity to restructure the way we do our education around understanding how this whole Earth system, including people, works, and moving ourselves towards sustainability as an educational opportunity. So I think the disconnect between saying, well, our role is educating students, and that sort of buys us a free pass to not retrofit our campus, I think is short-sighted. And if we reframe that to say retrofitting our campus is a way to educate our students about the way society and the Earth system works together, I think that's a real opportunity that we should all be seizing on as universities and educators, and which very few of us are. But we're starting to see that shift, but it's not there yet.
I think the university as the study system really appeals to me as an ecosystems person,
Well,
because why not, like you said, make this our place. But maybe I'll pass it to Ian. You're at a smaller school, maybe not with the same staffing and faculty size as Mike. What's your view of making your university the study system, and do you have the capability, capacity to kind of take this on versus kind of consultants, the other path?
Yeah, well, just on that last point, I think we are shifting somewhat to that study system. I think it's happening, more slowly than probably I would like, and it's not as widely recognized as it should be. But there are some really unique things that are happening, at institutions like ours and across the board that are starting to connect some of those dots. It's definitely later than and taking longer than it should have, but I think there's some recognition now that we can do both, right? We can address our own operations as well as build that into the curricular mindset as well. On the side of consultants versus in-house, we've like Mike, our initial greenhouse gas inventory was done through an external consultant, but it was utilizing a recent grad, an alum, and she was largely the in-house specialist that was working for that consulting firm out of Denver, and that gave us a baseline to start to work with. And since then, we've really scaled up, building our own capacity in-house, right? So on one hand, I think that the investment in people is probably never enough, right? Our office consists of me and then one full-time paraprofessional, and we oversee 20 to 40 paid interns and volunteers, student interns and volunteers. And so, like everyone else, I think we're probably overworked. We can always use more help, but we've also really focused on being creative about the way that we leverage that educational and co-curricular mission in order to build some of that capacity in-house, right? On the other hand, it's been a core part of our strategic plan, and it's something that's now built into everyone's job description on campus in some way. And we have developed a professional development program through our human resources department to start to build in not necessarily deep expertise, but knowledge and capacity across all of our employee base. And so we're investing heavily in that effort as well. And then getting back to the educational mission that we've discussed, I know just continuously, reinventing that and investing in new educational opportunities for our students to impact things, both on our campus, yes, but then also beyond our campus, things that we can't control. I know Mike had mentioned things that we can't control, like air travel. And certainly that's true. It's out of our direct control. But we also look at ways that, we've developed, some an economics of international climate policy course, for example, that takes, because of our unique block plan, it affords us large blocks of time, and we've been able to register as an observer NGO to the United Nations and take students to the COP and learn how international policy is made through organizations like AIDA and UN and just international agreements that can help move that needle further down the road and outside of our institutions where we don't have as much direct control over those things. And so I think it spans the runs the gamut of nowhere near enough investment to, but yes, we're still doing all of these things. And so that, of course, is also in direct competition with all of the other financial, requirements and strategic goals and things. And so it's finding how does that relate to strengthen and build within all of those other goals as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks for sharing experience from across your institutions. We have just a few minutes left till the top of the hour. I just wanted to kind of ask one more thought to each of you sort of as parting. And I was just looking at an analysis of the growth in CO2 emissions at the global scale. So it's this CO2 monitoring network of the Earth system. That's kind of my science. And, you know, most years, year after year, we have more CO2 being emitted than the year before. We all know CO2 concentrations are going up, but then there are these excursions where we reduce emissions. And if you look globally, not at any country or any place, and you go back the last 100 years, I'm looking at the graphic now, but the big negative excursions where we decreased our CO2 emissions started off in the 1920s. There's a few years that are labeled the Great Depression. Then World War II shows up as a negative anomaly, this like decrease. Then there's the oil shock in the 1980s where we decreased emissions. And then there's the financial crisis of 08, 09 that showed up in the atmospheric record. And then finally, 2020 is the biggest drop of all, COVID. And so when we look at the global picture, there's this association between these big negative events and then the atmospheric growth rate decreasing. We've been talking a little bit about, you know, not at the global scale, but can universities provide a, you know, beacon of another way to do this? Can we, in a positive way, be institutions, places that reduce their emissions, and, you know, we don't have to lock the doors and turn off the lights to have that happen? You guys are all working on making that happen. If we do it, say you succeeded at your individual institutions, do you think there's the mechanisms in place to communicate that to people?
Ted, you're frozen up on my screen. I don't know.
Yeah.
Same.
Okay. Well, I guess we just hang out for a sec. Oh, now you're back. Ted, are you still
Sorry, I'm
there?
gonna turn my video off. Do you have my audio?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so just the question was, can universities provide a positive example? And even if we achieved it, will people know this? That's my question, if that makes sense. Ian, can I pass it to you?
Yeah, I'd love to lead that. We on our campus did achieve that as of January this year. We started the year in the limelight, and some of the communications, conveyances were in place. We were in the national spotlight for what our students would call a hot minute. And then the pandemic happened and kind of shifted that limelight. So I don't know long term if, you know, how this works out from that, you know, sending the message nationally and globally standpoint just yet. But more locally at home, you know, I think it's you know, the message continues to resonate with our students. They are more involved with civic policy in our local community, where that hasn't always been the case. One of the downfalls of the block plan often is that it's created a sort of bubble that has been difficult to break. And so we're seeing some of that change and attitudes change. And they've been directly responsible and involved in the acceleration of the decommission of the coal plant that's immediately adjacent to our campus and right in the urban downtown area. And very vocal about adopting renewable energies to replace that, which has largely helped us meet you know, our carbon neutrality goals, particularly from the scope 2 of the electrical purchases standpoint. So on a large scale, you know, is the communications mechanism there? I don't know, but I'm seeing, you know, on the smaller scale that it's having an impact locally, and hopefully that those successes are being, as I said earlier, I think this has been done, you know, in a very replicable way, and hopefully we get the opportunity to interact with more people in the future to help share that experience and build on that.
Yes, well, it's great to hear the success of your institution, and I think having success locally is like a great place to start. So, Mike, quickly, what's your thought? And then Stephen, I'll ask you and we'll wrap it.
Yeah, a great question. I think both are absolutely necessary. We have to have the action around our own footprint and communicate that out so partners and other entities can receive that and take inspiration from it and move forward. And perhaps we can even help those as institutions ourselves to help move them along. But I will also add that that communication effort helps reinforce the action by the university to continue this path. So as we reduce emissions, we communicate that out to our campus communities and the wider community. The recognition that brings helps reinforce leadership engagement to continue to take that action. So communications is important, both I think from an external as well as an internal function.
Yeah, good point. It's a two-way street. Stephen?
I completely agree with everything that was said so far by Ian and Mike. I'd like to just say that I think that universities have a really key role here in helping cut through the complexity of this question. So, we've talked, this conference is about the bumpy path to net zero, but net zero is not the goal. Zero is the goal. And, so we have an opportunity in our choices, whether we choose a biofuel or not, whether we rely on offsets or not, what offsets we choose to deal with, what offsets we don't. We have a way of leading on these issues that are really very complicated. There's so much talk about net zero from every corporation out there. And most often they're buying cheap offsets that aren't really doing anything for keeping CO2 out of the atmosphere. We have an opportunity to use the knowledge base that we have on our campuses to sort of cut through that noise and chart a path that really is going to help us to get to zero, as opposed to just sound like we're getting to zero. And I think that's a really important role we can play in communication. Whether or not it's enough, I mean, we'll find out. I certainly will continue to try to help make it enough, and I know everyone here will. I don't have a crystal ball, and on my bad days, I'm not so optimistic, but we have to try.
Great. Well, thanks, panelists, for your wisdom during this panel and others. It's been great to hear what's going on. And with that, I will pass it back to the moderators as we move to our final wrap-up session. Anyway, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, all panelists and Ted for moderating. I'd like to hand it over to